Welcome to Questions and Coffee with Pastor Brad. I'm Brad McFadden. I'm pastor of Bright Star Church in Hopkins County, Texas. If you have questions you'd like to send to me or have things you want me to consider about some questions maybe I've already attempted to answer, but I didn't take some scripture into account, or you want me to address it in a different way or with a different a passage with, in light of a separate passage I didn't mention, please send your questions, comments to pastorbrad@brightstar.church. Today's question is what I'd like to call a can of worms, because it's almost impossible to answer in one video. I'm going to try to keep this to 20 minutes. I may have to do a part one and a part two here. Let me read you the question. What does "this generation will not pass away until all these things take place"? See Matthew 24:34. I have it pulled up here for you. I'm going to read it from the New King James Version here. I'm going to read it in just a little, just verse 34. Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Well, of course, the only way to understand this passage is to take it in context. However, I have received a couple of other questions kind of in the same vein as this, and so I want to address that as well. And that is, first, that if we interpret this generation to be 40 years of when Jesus was speaking, in other words, we're taking generation literally as a 40-year period, then all these things mentioned in that passage had to take place within 40 years of Jesus saying this. What took place within 40 years of Jesus saying this? The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So, did all these things take place then in 70 AD, okay, or by 70 AD, okay? Well, we have to know what all these things are, right? And we need to see this in context. We're going to have to take this passage in context to understand this passage completely. First of all, what is all these things? Right here, if we just look right above this, he talks about his second coming, okay? Then the Son of Man will appear in heaven. This is the very verse right before this. The Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. All right. So we know, first of all, and then let's just keep reading to read this in context. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches have already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the door. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So what is all these things? Well, one of all these things is his return, his second coming. Now, there are some that want to say, well, 70 AD was part of his first coming. He was coming in judgment against Jerusalem and against the old covenant, or the people who were trying to keep the old covenant. There's a problem with that. If we look at his ascension, when the promise of the second coming is given, let's start with this one, Mark 16:15. This is the very end of Mark. So then, after our Lord had spoken, he was received up into heaven and set down at the right hand of God. Okay, so at his ascension, he went and sat down at the right hand of God right then. Okay, in fact, we even see when Stephen was stoned, he saw into heaven and saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Jesus stood up, because that's a whole nother lesson, but he's standing at the right hand of God. So clearly he has ascended. Okay, so if he were to come back, that would be a second coming. And the way it is described, in fact, we can go to Acts and see the same thing. In the very beginning of Acts, it tells us, verse 9, After he spoken these things, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven, he went up. Behold, two men stood there in white apparel, and said, why are you standing, gazing into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up with you into heaven will come in a like manner, so as you saw him go into heaven. So if he returns, that's the second coming. It can't be part of the first coming. Okay, Jesus. If Jesus came in 70 AD, that was his second coming, because there's only two comings talked about. He had to have left the right hand of God and come back. Okay, so there's no biblical basis for saying or for showing there's no scripture I can take you to and say, here's where they're getting that 70 AD, that the destruction of the temple was part of Jesus' first coming. It's just not there. In fact, there's nothing in the Bible that says he will be there as the temple is destroyed. The temple was destroyed by the Romans, and Jesus didn't destroy it. So did he allow it to happen? Yeah, he predicted it to happen, and he ordained it to happen, and it did happen. Okay, so in that sense, he did it, but he didn't come. It wasn't a coming. The only place you can get any of that is from a passage from one of the manuscripts of Josephus that talks about seeing angels in the clouds as Jerusalem is being destroyed. All that language there is to promote. It's sort of what scholars call. I don't remember the word, but it just means to add descriptions to make it interesting and to add to the power of Rome. Okay, the reason why he's writing that way is just to describe the power of Rome as it destroyed Jerusalem. Again, I'm not a scholar, and I don't care about Josephus. I'm just saying that's the only place where anything is mentioned about clouds or seeing, maybe even angels within the clouds, but they wouldn't have called them angels. They would have said they were gods, Rome would have. But anyway, that's Josephus. I'm talking about from the Bible. There's no place where Jesus is supposed to be at the destruction of the temple or that he was at the destruction of the temple. It's just not there to show you. But we can see in Matthew, so we know in Matthew that all these things must take place before this generation, the second coming of Christ. So second coming of Christ is one of the things that is all these things. What is the rest of all these things? Well, we got to back up. So let's back up. The problem with this passage is to take it in context. You really got to start. You really have to do a study of Matthew to take it in real context. But if we go back, let's just go back to Matthew 23:13. I think you have to at least start there to see the context of what Jesus is saying at the end in Matthew 24, because it's all one sort of conversation with a little separation when they move from the temple to the Mount of Olives. But if you start at verse 13, you see he starts woeing. He starts issuing some woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. Okay, he calls them hypocrites, and he lists a bunch of charges against them, devouring widows, and he just goes through this whole list of different things. Calls them sons of hell in verse 15. Calls them blind guides in verse 16. Issues another woe. Just one woe after another. 23 is another woe. Call them blind fools. You can just read all through this and see this is all just condemning the scribes and Pharisees, just condemning them over and over and over again. Again, another one in 27, another one in 29. Then he gets down to verse 31 and sort of lays, calls them a brood of vipers, calls them serpents. This is his final kind of woe to them. And look down in verse 35. That on you may come all the righteousness blood shed on all the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. Now, Abel was killed, obviously, in the beginning of Genesis. And the blood of Zechariah, that was 500 BC. So those two deaths, Zechariah lived in 500 BC. 520 is when he wrote the book of Zechariah. But anyway, so you see his death would have been somewhere within 500 BC, 500 to 400 BC. All right. whom you murdered. Okay, now this is very important to understand. Jesus is right here saying that they murdered, that the blood is from righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah is on them, whom you murdered. Now wait a minute. They're living in 30 AD. Jesus is making this statement in early first century. And so he's saying you murdered them, and they lived 500 BC to Abel, which was 4,000 BC, maybe somewhere in there. So, and then he says, but he's saying that they murdered. So he's talking about them as a group, right? Obviously, he's talking about the scribes and the Pharisees and their mentality, their character, their genre of being is who murdered them. You murdered them. Okay? And he could just be talking about Zechariah, because it does say whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So if he's only talking about Zechariah, he's still talking about something they themselves, they personally didn't do, right? That was 500 BC. So if you attract, and I don't want to get into the Greek, but even if you say that you murdered between the temple and the altar only applies to Zechariah. In other words, he's only accusing them of the murder of Zechariah, even though the blood is from Abel to Zechariah. All the righteous dead are going to be on their heads. But nevertheless, my point remains. You murdered Zechariah between the temple and the altar. They themselves didn't do it. It was their people. It was the scribes and the Pharisees. And what does he call them in verse 36? Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. You see, he calls the scribes and the Pharisees this generation. The scribes and the Pharisees are the ones that these things are going to come upon. He doesn't mean this generation as in everybody who was alive at this time. That's what, when we think about generation, we think about Generation X or Generation Y. We mean everybody who was born between this year and this year is a certain generation. But obviously that's not what he's talking about. And when we look at that word in the Greek, let's just do a little bit of that. Can I pull that up? I think I can. Let me see. Right here. But double checked. Let me double check to make sure you can see that. Yeah. All right. Good. Okay. So you see the word there in the Greek is genia. Genia. Let me go back to where I was. Where was I? There I was. And I can pull that up here as well. And so you can see the word. It's hogenia, okay, which is meaning generation. Ho is, you can't see with the pop-ups, can you? But it's an inflection, okay? And then genia is the root word there for generation. Now let's look at that over here. There we go, generation. Well, this is not the one I wanted. I wanted the Blue Letter Bible. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. You can see here it's age, generation, nation, or time. But when we look deeper at this word, which I want to do, so when we look, in the lexicon at this word, when we see that its primary definition, and I'm not saying that it can't mean everybody who's alive today, okay? It can. That word can mean, and its main meaning is fathered, birth, or a nativity. Okay, so that's generation, fathered, birth, nativity. That genea word is very related to a generation of people, or the second generation, third generation, that kind of thing. So when you take a picture of a father, a grandfather, a father, and a son, you would be taking a picture of 3 generations, and that word can be used to describe that. But it's not the only meaning of the word. It can have a metaphoric meaning. And the second meaning, B there, in the Blue Letter Bible, you can look it up yourself, blueletterbible.org. It's just where I'm at. I'm looking at the Strong's outline usage for this word. And you look under B, and it says the metaphorical use of this word is a group of men very like each other in endowments or pursuits or character. Okay? So you see that it can have, in the Bible, it can have other meanings. And here he is obviously using that meaning to describe the scribes and the Pharisees. He's saying, I lost my place. I switched from, there we go. He's saying that these people the scribes and the Pharisees that he's been woeing on for all this time, just scribes and Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees. Every paragraph begins with scribes and Pharisees. And here at the end, he's issuing his final judgment against them and is saying, this generation, meaning scribes and Pharisees, the generation of scribes and Pharisees, okay? All the bloodshed is going to be assigned to them. Okay, so we can see that this generation can mean something other than everybody alive right now or a 40-year period of time. It doesn't have to mean that, okay? It's not limited to that. And we need to understand that when we get down here to this bottom passage. And by the way, Jesus is going to tell you, that isn't what I mean. So it's not just my speculation of which meaning to take. Jesus himself is going to tell us which meaning to take here. All right, let's look down. So the very next thing that happens here is that he's weeping for Jerusalem, okay? So he says, I'll weep for Jerusalem. Your house is left to you desolate. He's sad, because they killed the prophets, and you just read it down there. And then verse 24, he predicts. Okay, I don't have time to go through every one of these verses, but read them for yourself. It's right there. And the next thing that happens is he predicts the temple being thrown down, the temple being destroyed. That is the very next thing that happens in in chapter 24, verse 1. And he says the temple is going to be destroyed, which did happen in 70 AD, by the way, in history. Then in verse 3, they go to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples sit down and ask him two questions. And this is what he's going to respond to. Okay, so this is tying the two things together. The disciples are tying the previous conversation that happened at the temple and his prediction that the temple would be destroyed, and his prediction and his woe and his damning, basically, of the scribes and Pharisees, the generation of scribes and Pharisees. And he says, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. You see, there's two questions. Now, you could say, or some have said that, well, it's really three questions, because it's when will these things be, what will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the end of the age. But it's grouped together correctly in the Greek. Okay, it really is two questions. The disciples are at least connecting his coming, Jesus' second coming, with the end of the age. Okay. Now, if Jesus wanted to break this down and go, wait a minute, guys, that's three things, he could have done that, but he didn't. He just simply answered both of these questions with his response. And I think it's very telling what his response is. All right. His first response is a warning. Now, we know that when Jesus says all these things at the end, he's talking about his second coming. I mean, one of the things he's talking about in all these things is his second coming. We can see that in the passage. We already looked at that. And the very first thing he warns against is people saying he's already come. He opens the answering their question with a warning. Wait a minute, guys. Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. You will see that you are not troubled, for all these things must pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Now he's talking about the revolt of Israel, that they revolted against Rome, and that didn't end until 135 AD. At Masada. So you have a lot happening. Okay, and he says don't panic, okay? That's not the end. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. And all these things are merely the beginning of sorrows. And they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So he's saying here that even, you being delivered to tribulation and all of you dying is not the end. In other words, he's kind of alluding to here the fact that you could say that he's saying, you're going to be killed before I come back. I'm not coming back in your lifetime. Okay, he could be saying that, but I don't think he really is. What he's saying is that if you die, or they're going to deliver you up, they're going to kill you, you're going to hear of deaths of Christians or deaths of each other. Don't worry about it. And then verse 10, don't think that that's the end. You can worry about it. He's not saying worry about it. He's saying that's not me returning. Okay, verse 10. And then many will be offended. Many will betray one another. He's talking about this great apostasy that the apostles talk about several times, this great falling away. Okay, and when you will hate one another, then there will be false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because of lawlessness, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Verse 13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations. And then the end will come. Okay? And so then the end will come. So now he's talking about the end. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads this, let him understand. That parentheses right there, whoever reads this, let him understand. The reason why it's in parentheses and not read is because it was added by Matthew. Okay? And it's a reference to Daniel. It means go read Daniel. Okay? Bottom line. He's saying, wait a minute, go read Daniel. Go understand what Jesus is talking about here. All right. And we're not going to take the time to go do that. Please do it. But that's where the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that brings desolation, or the abomination that makes desolate, however you want to translate it, that's what he's referring to. Okay, and Jesus is pointing out the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So he's connecting those two things. Jesus is. When you see it standing in the holy place, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not go down to take anything from the house. And let him who is in the field do not go back to take his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For there will be great tribulation, such as the not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor shall there ever be. All right, so we can say, is he talking about 70 AD right here? And let me go ahead and finish the paragraph. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh will be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Okay, so this is, basically about the Great Tribulation. Is that 70 AD? Well, certain people say, well, it had to be. Certain people say, well, it has to be because there is no temple. It's spoken, standing in the holy place. Well, there is no temple anymore. It was destroyed in 70 AD. So how could the abomination of desolation be in the temple that doesn't exist? Well, but it could be that they're going to rebuild it. And if you take the historic reading of Revelation, that's what's going to happen. The historic reading of Revelation, meaning that it was written in 92 or the early 90s AD, and he talks about the temple. So he's saying that temple is going to be rebuilt. Okay. He's talking about a future temple. So is Jesus talking about a future temple here after 70 AD? Well, we can kind of know this because the abomination of desolation was never standing in the holy place. The abomination of desolation, we don't really know what it is specifically, but we do know that it is basically, from context, we can say that it is going to be in the Holy of Holies, in the temple, and it's what people are going to be. It's an idol. It's a false god. It's it could be a man. It could be a pig. It could be a statue. It could be whatever. Okay, we don't know what it is, but it is an abomination or some type of false idol, and that never happened in 70 AD. Even Josephus did not record any of this in 70 AD. In fact, they attempted it. If you read the what Josephus says is that I keep forgetting his name, the guy who led the attack on Jerusalem didn't want the temple destroyed. He wanted to turn it into a temple to Caesar. Okay, Caesar is Lord. He wanted to turn that into a temple to Caesar, but God didn't want that to happen because that could have been defined as an abomination of desolation, but it didn't happen. Instead, the temple caught fire. The looters were going in there and stealing stuff, and it caught fire. And all the gold melted, and that's when he ordered it to be torn down. But there was never an abomination of desolation. So there's just an issue there. But Jesus tells us right here that if this was 70 AD, okay, it can't be 70 because Jesus says, I'm not coming back then. In verse 23, look what he says. Then, when's then? The tribulation. Okay. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if anyone says to you, look, here he is in the desert, do not go. Look, here he is in the inner rooms. do not believe it. Jesus issues his second warning that he is not returning this way. He's not in the return. So the destruction, even if you say this is 70 AD, Jesus still didn't return at that time. So all these things then is not referring to the destruction of, must take place within this generation. Okay, so all these things does include his return, and it does include the destruction of the temple, right? But he's saying that didn't happen. He's warning us. It's not going to happen. That wasn't me. Then he goes into what his second coming is going to look like. He says, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will be the coming of man be. For wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. That's a little, that's one of those idioms from the culture that you may not understand. But he's talking about carrion birds there. Not eagles as in bald eagles, but eagles as in carrion birds. Okay, birds that eat dead things. And it's kind of a weird way of saying it, but what he's talking about is this is the gathering together of Christians. Okay, where the flesh is, then the eagles will be there also. So he's talking about the gathering of Christians. Okay, because he also said, I will gather together from the four ends of heaven, and he's going to say that again. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Okay, so now he's going back. He's saying, hey, tribulation, not me coming. Don't believe people when they say I've come back. And then he says in 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Now, many people cling to this and saying, well, that didn't happen in 70 AD. Well, okay. But remember, this passage doesn't have to be taken literally. This is mentioned other places in the Bible as very symbolic language, just to meaning that a nation is being destroyed, that a nation that the power and authority, or the God-ordained authority of a nation, is being removed. And you can just look that up, and it's mentioned in Isaiah, and I think another place too. The same language, same words are used to describe the fall of a nation. So it doesn't have to be taken literally, but it could be. Don't get me wrong. There could be a literal fulfillment of this kind of symbolic language, and I tend to think that there will be, but that's me. But even if you take it symbolically, it's fine. I mean, it doesn't hurt anything. It just means the changing, the tearing down of a nation. All right, verse 30. Then the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Okay, whoa. Now we have him coming. Okay. So immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and in other words, the nation will be torn down, or a literal fulfillment of this, whichever. Then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, and the power and the great glory, and he will send his angels with a great sound and trumpet, and they will gather together the elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the other. Okay? So after the tribulation, don't go anywhere during the tribulation and say, oh, Jesus has come back. He's over here in this room, or he's out in the desert. Nope. During the tribulation, if you mean that to be 70 AD, and of course, the people who were in Jerusalem did go through a tribulation. It was a horrible time. They were besieged. And it talks about the fact they were even eating their babies. Now, that's not in the Bible. That's from some historical reports. But even if they did, and which is fine, and they were starving to death, they were so bad off, they were eating their own children, which it may just be hyperbole, it may just be an overstatement again to make it how, don't rebel against Rome, or you're going to eat your own children, whatever. But the point is that it was bad, and I don't think anybody argues that the siege of Jerusalem was bad, and it might have been horrible. It might have been so bad that it was, awful. People starving to death, people with no hope, people, whatever. That's fine. But that can't be. But Jesus said, I didn't come back during that. He's saying after that, okay, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So did Jesus come back immediately after 70 AD? Well, no. There's no record of that. He says it's going to be witnessed by everyone. Everyone will see it. Okay, it's going to be in the sky. It's going to be a report. Okay, he's going to be coming with great power and glory, and he will send his angels with the trumpet, and he will gather his elect together from the four winds. None of that took place. Okay, so his second coming, which is going to be just like his departure, okay, and it's going to be the gathering of the Christians. There's no Christian that reported that. All the Christian writers that were alive at this time and after this, even if you debate the dating of Revelation, if you want to try to put Revelation prior to 70 AD, which is, there's no reason to do that. There's no scholarly literature that says anything about that. Okay, the only reason to put Revelation prior to 70 AD is because you want it to be. Okay, but all the scholarly research says that it was about 90 AD is when it was written. And we even have a report that he was sent there by Diocletian, which was the emperor who was in the early 90s. Nero didn't send people into exile. He killed them. He tied them to stakes and set them on fire. Nero didn't expel people. He sent them into exile. And that would have been in the 60s. So anyway, I don't want to get off into, again, this subject is robust. It covers a lot of material, and I don't want to go into every little detail, but I'm just going to stick with this word right here, which says immediately after the tribulation, then Jesus says, then I'm going to return. Okay, and so then he tells the parable about the signs. Okay, this is where we get to this passage that started this whole question. So he says, when you see these signs, what are the signs? Well, the tribulation. Okay, that tribulation, and all of these things that he's just got through talking about, the desolation. When you see the abomination of desolation, when you see these things, okay, so then you will know that the time. What does it say? Know that it is near at the doors. Surely I say to you, and here we get to this passage. This generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. All these things meaning the tribulation and his return. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. So this generation, is he making a claim here? Because we've already seen that this generation can mean more than one thing. So is he saying that this generation, all the people who are alive today, this generation, or is he saying within 40 years, that definition of generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place? Well, we can say that, all these things haven't taken place because we haven't seen the abomination of desolation. We haven't seen Jesus' return. We haven't seen the gathering of the Christians. But we don't have to do that. We don't have to deduct it because he flat out tells us if we just keep reading. What is the very next thing he says? But of the day and the hour, no one knows. In other words, he doesn't know. Not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only. But the days, and we can see, let's see. Right, in Mark 13:32, which is a companion passage to this, he says, he makes it very clear that nor the Son, he says, but of that day and hour no one knows, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, only the Father. Okay, so this is something that only the Father knows when this will take place. So Jesus can't be saying within 40 years or saying that everybody alive today, that this is all these things are going to take place before everybody alive today passes away, or all these things are going to take place within the next 40 years. He can't say either of those things because he doesn't know. And he tells us, I don't know. Only the Father knows. What does he know? The signs. What is he telling us to watch for? The signs. Very clear. Okay. This generation there can mean one of two things. It can either mean the last thing the last time he used this generation, he was talking about the scribes and the Pharisees. So it very well could mean that the scribes and the Pharisees, that character, what does it say? A group of men, each with endowments and pursuits and the same character. That character of, now obviously some people say, well, the scribes and the Pharisees aren't around today. Well, they weren't around at the time of Abel either, right? But nevertheless, that legalistic attitude of the scribes and the Pharisees has always been around. And that deceitfulness has always been there. So he could be talking about the scribes and the Pharisees. And a lot of people think that it is. Personally, I tend to want to think that this generation means Christians, his generation. But he didn't say that. So, and I don't know. I just think it fits in the passage a little better if he meant this generation, in other words, Christians. Okay, these, my people, this holy generation, this peculiar people that I am going to call to me through salvation. But either way, we know if there's three meanings. It could mean a group of people with the same character or endowment. It could mean 40 years, give or take. And it could mean everybody alive today. We know that it doesn't mean two of these because of what Jesus says next. I'm not making a time claim here. He says, I'm not making a time claim because I don't know. Only the Father knows. I'm telling you the signs. So we know it has to be a group of people, whether it's the scribes and the Pharisees or Christians. There you go. And it really doesn't matter either way in how the passage, it could mean either one. Or it could just mean all people. It could mean, I don't think that that's what it means. But nevertheless, it doesn't change my point is that it doesn't change the meaning of the passage. If it means the scribes and Pharisees, if it means Christians, or even if it means just all people, people won't pass away. People are going to continue until all these things, and we'll see all these things. So either way, it doesn't change the meaning of the passage. That's my point. All right. So there you go. I think that's the answer to the question. We do have one more thing we need to address, because anytime, and I just know this because anytime this gets brought up, the other passage gets brought up too. Because there's another scripture that people always bring up in this conversation, and that is Matthew 16:28. So let's go to Matthew 16:28. Also, notice before we go there, before I hit enter, notice the ambiguity, ambiguity. I can't say that word all of a sudden. It jumped up. I have a disease. Notice the non-specific nature of this passage. Okay, he could have said this present generation. He could have been more specific. He could have said right here. He could have said He could have said the scribes and Pharisees. He could have said everybody alive today. Those people that are alive today will not taste death before all these things take place. Notice that he says pass away versus taste death. In other words, pass away means, it doesn't mean the same thing it means that we take it to mean. When we say somebody passed away, we mean they died, right? That their body died. But this passage right here, taken literally in the Greek, just means that they will not cease to be. So this generation will not cease to exist until all these things take place. It's not a mention of death, which it could have been. He could have said that because he does, and that's where we're going to go. Matthew 16:28. Assuredly, this is like a lot of people say, well, this is got, there's no ambiguity here. Ambiguity, I said it. Verse 28. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Boom, nail in the coffin. Had to be 70 AD. Had to be before all the disciples died. He's talking to his disciples. That's who's standing. Who's standing right there? His disciples. Boom, gotcha. Got to have already taken place. Jesus has already returned. Okay. First of all, if you take the Seventh-day Adventists, they don't see Jesus returned until 1844, I believe it is, somewhere in there, 1800s, whatever that is. Well, that would have been way after these people died. Jehovah's Witnesses say Jesus has already returned spiritually, but and I don't know what date they give it. I think, do they give it 70 AD? I'm not sure. And then you have the preterists who also give it 70 AD. So, this is like a passage that, yeah, if that's what he means, then sure, but is that what he means? who, just to be clear, who there are some standing here who shall not taste death. Who's standing here? That's the disciples. If we just go back up here, he's talking to his disciples. See, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples. Okay, so the only problem with this passage is you got to keep reading, because what he predicts or what he is saying here happens in the very next sentence. Some of you who are standing here today shall not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Verse 17. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter and James and John, 3. Some of the people who were standing there that day, right? Took them up on the high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking to him. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tabernacles, one to you and one to Moses and one to Elijah. Peter didn't get it. But anyway, he says, and while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my son, my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. And then the next thing he says is, arise and do not be afraid. Boom. This passage, by the way, verse 28 of chapter 16, is in all 3 of the Gospels. I mean, all 4 of the Gospels. 3 of the Gospels. 3 canonical Gospels. It's not in John. It's in Mark 9:1 and it's in Luke 9:27. And in all 3 cases, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the very next thing that happens is the transfiguration. So the fulfillment of the prophecy is right there together, clearly defining what he is talking about. But just in case you don't believe it, you can turn to 2 Peter 1:17, because Peter says, yeah, that was what he was talking about. In Peter 17, he says, for he received from God the honor and the glory which, when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we heard this voice come from heaven. We were with him on the day. We were eyewitnesses. He goes on to say, sorry, I didn't go over there, did I? Here we go. Starts in verse 16 here. He says, for we did not follow cunning devised fables when we made known to you the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So they were eyewitnesses of his coming, his majesty, the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. We're not making things up. We witnessed it. Okay, so they got a glimpse of it. 3 of them got to see it before they tasted death. Some of you who are standing here today will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his glory. 3 of them did. Some of them, the rest of them tasted death before they saw it. Okay? So I hope that answers your questions. That's the major objection that I know of that always comes up when we discuss just this generation passage. This, I could be wrong. But, and if I am, then when I get to heaven, the Lord will straighten me out. But if you have passages that you think I haven't taken into consideration, if you think that I didn't, that there's other scriptures I need to look at, or some scripture that I covered a lot of scripture today, maybe the one I went over too quickly for you, and you want me to really address it a different way. The thing is, I'm not spiritualizing anything here. I'm not trying to bend the Bible to fit my belief. If the Bible really taught me that Jesus had to return prior to now, I would be okay with that. That doesn't change the gospel. It doesn't change, really anything to me except for the hope of my coming, and that all of the warnings don't apply to me anymore. But I think those warnings do apply to me. Don't believe it when people say Jesus has already come. He tells us not to believe it unless we witness it. We will be witnesses to that act of his returning. And so, there you go. But again, like I said, if you want me to consider some of the passages or whatever, then please send them to me, Pastor Brad at brightstar.church. Okay? And that's all I got. If you have other questions you want me to cover or ask, or other scriptures you're struggling with that you want me to dig into for you, I'll be glad to do that. Send them to me. Thank you very much, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.